All right, back with more of your questions. So, do you remember the house where Lizzie and Mica died? Why didn't Carol and Tyrese stay? Didn't Tyrese want to stay because Mica said so? In a way, this actually really mirrored Beth and Daryl in some ways, and that was that Tyrese and Carol found a place to live, and they were going to basically stay and play house there. And there was nothing romantic between them, but they were going to raise these kids together, and they were definitely seriously considering staying. But the reason they didn't is just because the girls died, and then it was too much tragedy, too weird, and so they just decided to move on. But in a lot of ways, I think it mirrored kind of a theme they were trying to get across in season 4, which was that they all needed to find each other again. You know, they needed to be with family. They couldn't stop because a lot of them tried to stop. I mean, theoretically, even Rick and Michonne and Carl were probably at least considering staying in the house they were in, but the claimers showed up and chased them out, you know, and then they all tried to get to Terminus because it seemed like a safe place. So I think it was a theme of trying to find a safe place, thinking about setting up, you know, putting down roots there, and then something happens that keeps that from, you know, actually being something they can do, and they just need to go and find each other and be together as a family. So I think it had to do with that, but logistically it was just because the girls died, and then they just decided they didn't want to stay. So if that hadn't happened, then they really might have stayed there, and that would have obviously changed everything. So I hope that answers your question. All right, next one. You've probably covered this, but I don't know where to look. Sorry. That's okay. So a headshot is survivable. That's good to know. What I'm confused about is why would the group think Beth reanimated and wandered off if they believe she died of a headshot? As far as they know, that's not possible, right? Or do they think she got devoured by walkers? Well, first of all, it's important to say we don't know for sure. This is part of the missing 17 days, and we don't really know how it's all going to play out. It may be very differently than what we have theorized. But the theory is that when, you know, the walker horde came through and they were trying to bury her, they left her in a car, and they were planning to come back to finish the burial so that they could all, you know, put her to rest and get closure. But when they came back, she was gone. So I think that, you know, because she was shot so high up on her forehead, there's a very good chance that it would not have killed her, of course, but even if it had killed her, that it would not have dug into her brain the way that, you know, you would need something to in order to keep them from reanimating. And at the time, they wouldn't have really thought of that. You know, it just wouldn't have occurred to them because they were so heavily in the throes of their grief. But when they came back and she was gone and it looked like she had staggered off, then they might have gone, oh, you know, she was shot really high up. That wouldn't have like traversed her brainstem because it was way too high on her head. So I bet she turned. You know what I mean? So I think it would have just been logical to them to think that and to realize that they had made a mistake, or, you know, so they would think, by not having stabbed her in the brain. But it's good they didn't do that because then she really would have died, right? So yeah, that's the idea. That's what we kind of think, or maybe some variation of that if we're a little bit off on the details. Do they think she got devoured by walkers? I don't think so. I was originally going to say it's possible they think that, but I just always go back to episode 515 where Daryl looks into the face of the blonde girl who's tied to the tree. If he really thought that Beth had been devoured by walkers, he wouldn't have needed to do that, I don't think. It was like him needing to reassure himself that it was not her, even though that's not logical, even though they were 500 miles away, so how could it possibly have been her? You know, it was a psychological thing where he needed to reassure himself that it wasn't her, and the only reason he would need to do that is if he thought she was still out there somewhere as a walker, right? So that's why I don't think he really thinks she got devoured by walkers. He thinks she turned and is a walker somewhere, and that one scene from Try, which is 515, is the whole reason we think that. That's the only explanation there could possibly be for that scene. So again, we don't know for sure exactly how it all went down, but that's kind of the basic theory about it. All right. Is there any Beth-related symbolism around Daryl losing one of the wings on his vest? Yes, actually there is. So this is actually kind of involved, but it's really kind of lovely. So the most obvious thing would be that his missing wing represented him losing Beth, right? And that's kind of what we originally thought it must be. There's only one problem with that, and it's a really tiny detail. And that is simply that it's the right wing on his vest that went missing. Now, in Still, when Beth hugged him from behind, she's literally resting her cheek against the left wing. And so we've always thought that the left wing represented Beth. And in fact, I have this edit about it. And guys, I put this together during season 6. So it was long before he lost that wing that I already thought that. And I mean, it could still represent him losing Beth if, just in a general way that he lost a big part of himself, if you're not being too picky about right and left and which one represents her, which, sometimes it's fluid. And so we don't always need to be picky about that. But it still felt, when we were looking at it, it still felt like we were missing something, the fact that it was the right wing. The other thing is that we don't see how he lost that wing. To this day, they've never showed us what happened to his vest, that one of the wings got, shredded off or whatever happened. And we keep thinking that they'll show us how it happened, but they still never have. Now, is it actually important how he physically lost that wing from his vest in the show? Maybe not. I think what's more important is the symbolism and the fact that we haven't seen what happened. It makes it something that's mysterious and something that's unseen and maybe something that's not even physical. Maybe it's something more emotional or psychological. So while analyzing, reanalyzing, and overanalyzing Find Me, the one with Leah in it, for the millionth time, I suddenly kind of came to a realization about that wing. And I don't even remember exactly how I came to it. I just remember one day it clicked for me. And I realized that it's probably true that the right wing does not represent Beth. I think it represents Daryl. And so the point is that after he lost her, he lost himself. He lost who he was. He lost his way in a big way. And so that's why that wing disappeared. And the thing that's kind of sweet about it is that the left wing stayed, which, because we think the left wing represents Beth, she's always with him and she's still around. And even in his mind and in his heart, she's still there. Even when he lost himself, he was still thinking about her. And we think that's the writer's way of showing that. Now, if we take it a little further, remember that eventually when he went back to Team Family and, started taking care of the kids and everything, there, it's Judith who mends it for him and puts the blue wing on. And I think it's safe to say that in taking care of those kids, he kind of found himself again and came back to who he was before. And he really, in the last couple of seasons, has been more, more positive, more well-adjusted than we've seen him since season 4, right? He's just been in a more healthy mindset. And it's because he had kids to take care of and he wanted to take care of them for Rick and all of that. So it just kind of works really well with the symbolism. And again, in a very general way, because it was losing Beth that led to him losing himself, the lost wing could definitely still represent him losing Beth. But if you want to get into the more minute details, I think the left wing still represents her and the right wing represents him. So yeah, that's kind of our theory about that. And it's really kind of fun to see and to, even in France, he still has his vest. He didn't wear it very much during the whole season, the first season. He was wearing it when he washed up on the shore. And then, of course, he changed into more the clothes that he wore throughout most of the first season. But when he goes to leave at the very end in the final episode, we see him pack the vest, so he still has it. It's still with him, and I think that was, in a lot of ways, a reminder of who he is, and maybe to some extent that Beth is still around, and maybe even a foreshadow of her arriving soon. So, hope that helps, but there's definitely some Beth symbolism in the wings of his vest, and I think the biggest thing to remember is that when the characters have such a huge, iconic symbol of them, we need to pay attention to what's happening with it. So it's the same way we would pay attention to something happening with Michonne's sword, or Rick's python gun, or, Beth's knife. I mean, these are things that represent the characters in a almost very literal way, and so we need to pay attention to what's going on with them. So anything that happens with Daryl's crossbow or his vest is going to end up being important and probably mirrors or foreshadows what's going on with his arc. So you're definitely right to be looking at that. So I hope that helps. Okay, next one. Hiya, a few weeks ago I asked you about TWD Destinies, and after its release, I can speak for everyone when I say it was very disappointing, gameplay-wise. I did want to tell you about a particular choice involving Beth, though, as I'd like to know your thoughts. The first one that jumped out at me was a choice that is straight up save Beth or save Carl. I just find this so strange as it's putting Beth against one of the most important characters in the show. If you choose to save Beth, Carl dies as he can't get the surgery after being shot. It also makes me laugh as they literally took the time in the game to retrieve her body from the horde and give her a burial, something that didn't actually happen in the show. Weird how they chose to include this, as it would be much more unrealistic to be able to bury her here than it would be in the show. There's also a medicine theme around her death in the game. On the other hand, if you chose to save Beth, Shane carries her very strangely. She's not injured, she just tripped, so why add this shot? The only thing I can think of is that maybe this is how they, probably Tyrese, carried Beth through the herd after she was shot, and it's a foreshadow of this. As soon as I saw this, I thought of you and just needed to hear what you think. Any thoughts? Yeah, this is super interesting, so thanks for sending this in. To me, I think it's interesting that they juxtapose her with Carl, because we actually did see a lot of Beth symbolism, yes, but specifically like Phoenix symbolism around Carl's death. And that was interesting because he really did die. He's not going to come back. This Phoenix rises from the ashes, and it's very much a resurrection symbol. So it's like, okay, well, why are they putting that around his death if he got bit by a walker and really is dying, right? So the thing that I came up with that because there's a lot of it that to this day we're not entirely sure what they meant by it, but my guess is that when in season 4, Rick put the hat on Beth and called her the new sheriff in town, it was a symbol and a foreshadow that she was going to supplant Carl as heir to Rick's sheriffism. I mean, the obvious thing would be that Carl would follow Rick as the new sheriff in town, and that is what happens in the comic books, right? He becomes the leader as he grows and takes his father's place. But I believe that putting the hat on her, like literally it fell off of Carl, right? Because he was digging with the shovel and he was learning to be a farmer, and the hat tumbled off his head and hit the ground, and Rick picked it up and put it on Beth's head and said, there's a new sheriff in town. So that tells me that even back in season 4, even though nobody, including us, could have guessed this, and they certainly weren't being very heavy-handed in hinting at it, they already knew clear back then that they were going to kill off Carl eventually. And actually, there is one other major symbol of this, and that is that it has nothing to do with Beth, but when Carl, it's in after, so 409, after the prison falls, and it's about Carl walking around with Rick, and then he can't wake Rick up, and so he goes to eat the pudding at the pudding house, all of that. There's a part on the road where the walker falls on him, and he's fighting it, and they do the exact same shot, like the exact same camera work there, as they do in the scene many seasons later with Saeed when Carl is bitten, and they purposely parallel those two shots to show that part in 809 was a foreshadow of Carl eventually being bitten and dying. Okay, so they 100% knew in season 4 that they were eventually going to kill off Carl. It's just that none of us do that. So I think the reason they're probably juxtaposing her and Carl in the game is the same reason that they put the hat on her in that scene, and that is that when it tumbled off Carl, the other thing I was going to say is that there's a part in the episode, it's not the one where he dies, it's right before that, so it's episode 8, where at the end of the episode we find out he's been bitten, and then in episode 9 he dies when they come back, right? In episode 8, I think it's after he talks to Negan. He's standing at the top of the wall talking to Negan and looking down. And then when he comes down off the water, the hat tumbles off his head again in the same way that it did in 416, right? So either way, it tumbles off his head, and then Rick picks it up and puts it on Beth and says that she's the new sheriff in town. So it just shows that she is the one, not Carl, who's going to end up being the heir to Rick's legacy as the leader and as the new sheriff in town. So that is probably why they're doing that in the game. As to why he carries her that way, I think that's super interesting, and that I kind of think you nailed it. I mean, I think that's probably why. It's a hint towards something that we haven't actually seen yet. So it'll be interesting to see if somebody, if it's Tyrese or even Daryl carries her that way, if they try to carry her away and then it just gets to be too hard, and so they end up leaving her behind. And then as for the burial, That, too, I think is a hint toward what happens during the 17 days, because we do believe that they tried to bury her and there was some semblance of a burial, but it just got interrupted, right? So yeah, that's all just super interesting. Even if the game is a little bit disappointing, I'm glad that you sent this in. I think it's important, and I think it's being done intentionally, and I like it. It makes me happy. So yes, thank you very much. Those are my thoughts. And yeah, let us know if anything else comes up. Yeah, send it in again, because I really am interested to see where some of these games go and what kind of hints they give us. So thank you for that. All right, guys, as of the recording of this, that is all the asks I have in my inbox. So if I don't get any more, then I will just see you in the new year. And if I do, then I may be back for another video or two. We'll see. All right, everyone, have a fabulous holiday. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and all of that. And yeah, here's hoping that 2024 is the year that we will finally get Beth back and see what we've all been waiting to see since season 4. I'll see you guys then.